All right, so I really enjoyed Jeffrey Tucker's speech last night, particularly his comment that ideas can change the world. They can, and that's why I created Quillette. The actual meaning of the word Quillette is, it's the French word for a wicker offcutting that you plant into the ground, which goes into a tree. So that's a metaphor for an idea. If you express an idea in an essay and it gets read by a wide range of people, it can blossom into a movement, it can change the world. So I really believe in the transformative power of ideas. But bad ideas can change the world too. And there are a lot of bad ideas going around at the moment and growing in popularity. I made a list of bad ideas just off the top of my head on the train coming in. All right, so some bad ideas, and there are many more. There is no such thing as objectivity. There is no such thing as objective truth. Language creates reality. Words are violence. White women's tears are violence. The West is an oppressive white supremacist patriarchy. The reason why Western nations are rich is because they stole wealth from colonized lands. The reason why non-Western nations are less prosperous, comparatively, is because they had their wealth stolen. It's nothing to do with institutions, it's nothing to do with social norms or innovation. It's one group of people stole the wealth from another. Free speech is a tool of white supremacy, and is used to bolster the status quo. There's no such thing as reverse racism or reverse sexism. Objective research methods in fields like sociology are tools of whiteness. Quantitative research methods are patriarchal. Science has been one long project in proving the inferiority of women or people of colour and needs to be decolonized. These are all really bad ideas. Another idea that I haven't written here is this idea that all disparities between genders or races are caused by discrimination. If there's fewer women on corporate boards, it's because of sexism. But these ideas are incredibly popular. If you switch on ABC The Drum, you'll get a whole panel talking about how the fact there isn't 50-50 gender parity on corporate boards is because of discrimination and sexism. Other factors are not taken into account, such as the fact that women overwhelmingly go into professions which are women overwhelmingly go into caring professions which look at people, such as medicine, law, vet science, biology, health sciences, education. These are all fantastic professions, but because there isn't gender parity on corporate boards, somehow we live in this patriarchal, oppressive society. So we're soaked in bad ideas, faulty ideas, and we have to counter them. So how do we do that? Well, my view is that you counter these bad ideas through creating cultural capital. And one thing that conservatives and libertarians aren't necessarily good at is creating cultural capital at the same rate as those on the left, even the hard left. I think there's a big gap there. And I think all that needs to happen is alternative narratives need to be provided, and we need to have trusted personalities delivering them. It's not rocket science. And as Tom's going to mention, our legacy institutions are dying. So mainstream media institutions, they're collapsing because they've got no viable business model for the future. Universities are becoming less prestigious because they're becoming too biased, particularly in the humanities fields. So So there's great opportunity to disrupt these institutions. And one thing I wish conservatives would do less of is complain about bias in media and universities. I wish they would just go out and create their own institutions, okay, and disrupt what's going on. I think there's a massive opportunity for disruption. There are really low barriers for entry because of the internet. It doesn't cost anything to create a YouTube channel. It doesn't cost anything. It costs very little to create a website. And opportunity arises when incumbents are neglecting their responsibilities. So when mainstream media is neglecting to provide fair and balanced perspectives and fail to provide conservative or libertarian viewpoints, then that's an opportunity for a young, enterprising libertarian to start their own website and fill the gap. And so I think instead of complaining so much about the bias, I think we need to work out ways to take down these old institutions through disruption, through competition, and providing an alternative. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you to John and Tim for organising this wonderful conference. I've been very fortunate to have attended similar types of think tank conferences in Washington and New York, and just last year in London and, of all places, Stockholm. And this is right up there. It's a very good conference. It's a meeting of the minds, intellectually rigorous, and it's great to be back again. So thank you very much. I also want to thank and congratulate Claire. Claire is a real rising star in the new media world at a time especially when many serious subjects can't be discussed openly without inspiring hysteria, especially from those whom John Howard once famously called the self-appointed cultural dietitians of the world. He made that remark in 1996, and regrettably it's got a lot worse, I think, in the last 20 years. I thought that during the Howard Costello era, the centre of gravity had shifted a bit towards the right, crudely putting it, free markets and smaller government and more cultural conservatism, but clearly in the last 10 years, people like us are very much on the back foot, and it's largely because those self-appointed cultural dietitians have entrenched their role in public broadcaster, but also the universities. I'm a bit of an oxymoron. Stuart mentioned some of the things I've done and do. For the last 4 years I've been working at, of all places, the ABC, Radio National too, and I also write a column for the Fairfax Press. And until I started working at the CIS, I worked at the University of Sydney. So I've got the trifecta: the University of Sydney, Fairfax, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, and the ABC. And I've said this before, so excuse me if you've heard me saying this, to be a conservative or a classical liberal in this world is a bit like what Mitt Romney, the former Republican presidential candidate, said what it's like to be a conservative Republican in the liberal democratic state of Massachusetts. You're a cattle rancher at a vegetarian convention. You're isolated and you're condemned for not conforming to the smelly orthodoxy of political correctness. I could tell so many stories, but my favourite one recently was in June last year. It was a Friday morning and President Trump decided to pull the United States out of the Paris climate change accords. And I followed the ABC very closely on this day because I was working there and I was looking at all the radio, all of the television, all the online comment. And the overwhelming consensus among the reporters, the guests, the opinion makers, the news tone was that Trump was out of line. This would bring forward, Armageddon. And I just said to my producer, because I had a show at the time on a Sunday morning called Sunday Extra, I said, well, look, by Sunday morning, many people are going to be hearing this line morning, noon and night for 2 days running. They'll want to hear a different view. So I suggested my old friend, Lord Nigel Lawson, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Thatcher years, better known these days as Nigella Lawson's father. But Nigel had been on my show before, and this just generated so much outrage at the public broadcaster. And I invited Nigel this time to be the presenter's friend, to look at the orthodoxy, the conventional wisdom about all the arguments against America pulling out of the Kyoto Protocol. And the word got out to senior management at Radio National, and they staged an intervention. And they said, if I have Lord Nigel Lawson on the show on Sunday morning, I must have 2 climate enthusiasts debating him. Never mind those very climate enthusiasts, and these weren't just people who believed in climate change, that was one thing, as does Nigel. These were people who believed in reshaping the global capitalist system as a way of decarbonising the planet. 2 versus 1, and I have to say, and I try to be fair on the debate, but I think Nigel absolutely demolished both John Hewson and Tim Flannery in the morning. So there is hope at the public broadcast. There's hope even at Fairfax. But I think Claire made a very good point. Increasingly, a lot of these organisations, they run a line. It clouds their editorial output. This has been happening for a while now. My favourite example was in June 2004 when the great Ronald Reagan died. I watched the ABC's then premier current affairs program, Lateline, that whole week. Not one segment on Ronald Reagan. Not one segment on his legacy. Not even a debate about all the provocative and divisive things that took place during the 1980s. But when Gore Vidal died, the whole episode was dedicated to the famous left-wing American writer. When Milton Friedman died in late November 2006, nothing at the ABC, radio or television, on the great free market economist who won a Nobel Prize in 1976. But when John Kenneth Galbraith died 6 months earlier, there were special tributes throughout the day on the ABC radio. More recently, Lee Kuan Yew died in March 2015. Hardly anything on Lee Kuan Yew, the great anti-communist and supporter of free trade. But when Fidel Castro and Chavez died, there were special tributes. So this has been happening for a while. And I think Claire's point is absolutely right. It's all well and good for us to complain about bias in the arts and the commanding heights of Australian culture, but it's imperative that we find ways of providing outlets that challenge that orthodoxy. Now, there are obviously some good people at the Australian newspaper and News Corps that do that, but there will come a day when Rupert dies. What happens then to that great institution, the Australian, and to those tabloids that provide a counter voice to the prevailing mindset at the ABC and Fairfax? So I think it's absolutely imperative that we find ways of creating outlets that challenge the orthodoxy, and I'm very happy to say that Claire, especially given her youth and her talents as a communicator, is playing that role. She gets 2 million people downloading her content every month. 2 million people downloading her content online, and unfortunately something like only 2% come from this country. That's right. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So I think that's really the purpose of today's discussion, to say, yes, let's fret and wail about the left bias in much of the media and in the intellectual establishment, but there is a way to counter that argument by putting forward different arguments and creating new outlets to put forward those views and educating especially younger people.